$1 billion was a key that opened every door. A private Caribbean island, the loyalty of a serving senator, perhaps even the miracle of a transplanted heart. But on a Tuesday afternoon, slick with Seattle rain, Alexander Vance, the sovereign owner of half the city's skyline, discovered the one currency his empire could not mint. His 4-month-old son's next gasp of air. 18 of the world's most distinguished pediatric specialists, a collective pool of intellect and prestige worth untold millions, stood frozen around a meticulously sterile hospital bed. They were defeated, their collective PhDs, glittering awards, and towering professional egos rendered meaningless. The alarms on the monitors shrieked a digital lament, and as the billionaire, accustomed only to commanding, crumpled onto the sterile linoleum floor, the person who stepped into the abyss was not a doctor. It was Sarah, a nobody, a ghost, a waitress whose stained apron spoke of minimum wage servitude, there only to sanitize the periphery. Her action was so sudden, so shockingly reckless, so utterly unthinkable in that rarefied environment, that the hospital security detail instinctively drew their sidearms. But what unfolded in the next few minutes would rewrite the foundational texts of emergency medicine forever. The St. Jude's Charity Gala was an exercise in controlled extravagance, the kind of event where a single centerpiece of imported orchids cost more than the average American family's annual mortgage payment. The grand ballroom of the flagship Vance Intercontinental Hotel was a glittering, suffocating sea of black ties, liquid designer silk, and the blinding flash of investment-grade diamonds. Anchoring this monument to capital was Alexander Vance himself. At 34, Alexander stood 6'2", possessing a brutal, sharp jawline that genuinely looked as if it had been chiseled from polished granite. He was the chief executive officer of Vance Global, a logistics behemoth that flawlessly orchestrated the global movement of everything from crude oil tankers to specialized, life-saving vaccines. He was a man who didn't navigate outcomes, he manufactured them. If a cargo ship was delayed, he didn't complain. He purchased a new, more efficient shipping channel. If an established law proved inconvenient, he simply lobbied until the inconvenient clause was excised. He was formidable, undeniably brilliant, and utterly saturated with the assumption of his own power. Next to him stood his wife, Catherine, formerly a reigning supermodel, now a high-profile philanthropist. She was encased in a shimmering molten silver gown that fluidly sculpted her famously slender frame. Yet, tonight, neither the tectonic plates of global business nor the dictates of haute couture mattered. Tonight revolved entirely around Julian. Julian Vance, for months old, was a cherubic miracle, an infant portrait composed of his father's unervingly piercing blue eyes and his mother's exquisitely soft, delicate features. He was resting in a bespoke, climate-controlled bassinet, a futuristic pod that more resembled a miniature spacecraft than a traditional crib, positioned strategically and safely behind thick velvet ropes in the absolute center of the VIP sanctuary. "He's perfect, Alexander," a ranking senator chirped, leaning in conspiratorially to shake Alexander's iron grip. "You must be immensely proud." "He's a Vance," Alexander replied, his voice a low, smooth baritone utterly devoid of unnecessary warmth. Perfection is merely the baseline expectation. In the deep shadows of the vast ballroom, far removed from the champagne towers and the careless, ringing laughter of the elite, Sarah Miller adjusted the precarious weight of her heavy, overloaded tray. She was only 26, yet the relentless grind of poverty had etched lines into her face that made her look years older. Her tired blonde hair was dragged back into a severe, perpetually messy bun, and her mandated uniform, a black button-down and matching slacks, was 2 sizes too generous, hanging like a shroud off her noticeably gaunt frame. Sarah wasn't meant to be anywhere near the gilded VIP section. She was a runner, the absolute lowest rank on the catering hierarchy, tasked exclusively with clearing used glassware and discreetly mopping up spills. She kept her head permanently down, her eyes fixed solely on the polished marble floor. She desperately needed this shift. She needed the paltry $150 she would earn tonight to pay for the heat in her studio apartment, which had cruelly failed 3 days prior. "You there," a sharp, highly amplified voice snapped, cutting through the background jazz like a whip. Sarah froze. She slowly turned to face the event coordinator, a woman armed with a threatening clipboard and a permanently attached headset, who was glaring at her with contempt. "Table 4 needs water now, and fix your collar. You look like you slept in a dumpster." "Yes, ma'am." "Sorry," Sarah murmured, the apology automatic and rehearsed. She hurried toward the VIP tables, carefully clutching a crystal pitcher full of water. As she poured for a group of boisterous, laughing investors, she found herself standing mere feet away from the golden, high-tech bassinet. She risked a quick glance at the baby. He was awake, but his movements were strangely minimal. His eyes were wide open, locked in an unblinking gaze on the blinding crystal chandelier overhead. Sarah instinctively paused. She possessed a deep, primal intuition concerning children, perhaps developed while raising her 2 younger brothers when her parents had vanished into the bottle, or perhaps forged during the life she had lived long before everything she cherished had catastrophically disintegrated. Something about the baby's profound stillness felt acutely wrong. 4-month-old infants were supposed to be wiggling, reflexive, and responsive. Julian looked dangerously lethargic. Alexander Vance approached the crib, holding a tumbler filled with amber scotch. He looked down at his son, and a rare, genuine flicker of affection managed to penetrate his normally impenetrable icy mask. "Hey there, little man. Quiet tonight, aren't we?" Catherine joined him, her usual composure laced with visible anxiety. "He's been sleeping so much today, Alex. Maybe the noise is too overwhelming." "Nonsense." Alexander dismissed her worry with a wave of his hand. "He's a Vance. He's simply observing." Sarah finished pouring the water and began to pivot away, but her peripheral vision caught a fleeting glimpse of the baby's tiny hand. It twitched, not a normal reflexive motion, but a rhythmic, stiff, jerky spasm. Then the baby emitted a sound. It was not a healthy cry, but a high-pitched, desperate wheezing gasp. Sarah stopped dead. She knew that sound. "Move!" A nearby security guard grunted, roughly shoving her shoulder. "You're blocking the walkway." Sarah stumbled, but her eyes remained locked on the crib. "Sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the syncopated jazz band. "The baby." The guard ignored her. Alexander was currently laughing heartily at a crass joke the senator had just delivered. Suddenly, the wheezing ceased. Julian's face, which had previously been a soft, pale cream, began to flush a deep, angry, almost violent red. Then, in the span of mere seconds, the red horrifyingly drained away, leaving a ghastly, terrifying shade of blue ringing his delicate lips. Catherine's scream followed, a high-frequency sound that violently sliced through the music, the trivial chatter, and the clinking of expensive glass. "Alexander, look at him. He's not breathing." The massive ballroom instantly fell silent. The jazz band abruptly died mid-note. Alexander spun around, the tumbler of scotch slipping from his grasp. It shattered across the marble floor, crystalline shards flying everywhere like shrapnel. He violently ripped the silk canopy entirely off the bassinet. Julian was arching his back, his tiny mouth stretched open in a silent, desperate scream, his skin now turning a mottled, sickening gray-blue. "Call an ambulance," Alexander roared, his voice cracking with a raw, primal terror that no one in his orbit had ever witnessed before. "Get the convoy ready now." Security guards swarmed the section. Guests gasped and frantically pulled out their phones to record the unfolding tragedy. In the terrifying chaos, Sarah was forcefully pushed backward against a cold pillar. She watched, her heart hammering frantically against her ribs, as the billionaire scooped his limp, weightless son into his arms and sprinted toward the nearest exit, his expensive Italian leather shoes brutally crunching over the broken glass. The golden cage had been violently breached. The nightmare had officially begun. St. Jude's Medical Center was unequivocally the best hospital in the state, largely due to the sprawling new wing Alexander Vance had funded with a personal donation of $200 million just 3 years prior. When the CEO of Vance Global burst through the emergency room doors, clutching a rapidly dying infant, all standard bureaucratic protocols instantly vanished. There was no triage, no mandatory waiting room queue, and zero time wasted on insurance paperwork. Julian was instantaneously whisked directly into the Trauma 1 suite, a secured room equipped with diagnostics and life support technology that honestly rivaled NASA's Mission Control Center. Within 20 minutes, the hospital's executive-level code Omega had been activated. This was far more than a simple medical emergency. It was simultaneously a seismic PR crisis and a VIP catastrophe of the highest order. The hospital administrator, Dr. Marcus Sterling, a man who obsessively prioritized two things, his immaculate reputation and his critical donor list, personally took command. Dr. Sterling was tall, impeccably silver-haired, and usually exuded an air of detached, absolute authority, which was now thinly masking sheer terror. He immediately summoned every top mind the institution had to offer. By the 1-hour mark, 18 attending physicians and consultants were crammed shoulder to shoulder in the observation deck and the trauma room. The collective included Dr. Gregory Hausman, the chief of pediatric cardiology, Dr. Anita Raj, globally recognized as the leading neurologist specializing in infant trauma, and Dr. Benson, an expert in rare genetic disorders who had been flown in via executive helicopter from Stanford University. They were pulmonologists, toxicologists, allergists, and hematologists. The room was a pressurized sea of crisp white coats and deeply furrowed, frustrated brows. Alexander and Catherine stood huddled grimly in a secluded corner. Catherine was weeping silently, her extravagant makeup streaking down her face, now completely ruined. Alexander was pacing with the relentless, predatory energy of a caged tiger. He had savagely ripped off his expensive silk tie and aggressively unbuttoned his collar. He glared at Dr. Sterling with eyes that promised unimaginable violence if he did not receive immediate, actionable answers. "Talk to me, Sterling," Alexander snarled, his voice a low vibration. "Why is my son's oxygen saturation still dropping?" Dr. Sterling quickly wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Mr. Vance, we have stabilized his airway and are providing mechanical ventilation, but we simply cannot identify the cause. His heart is beating normally, but his blood is failing to effectively carry oxygen. We have definitively ruled out choking. We have ruled out every known cardiac defect. The MRI is completely clean. The toxicology screen is negative for all common household and industrial poisons." "I don't care what it's negative for," Alexander bellowed, slamming his fist against the drywall, the plaster cracking audibly under the force. "Tell me what in God's name is wrong with him. We are currently running a secondary panel for rare, heavy metals." Dr. Raj interjected, her voice professional but severely strained. "It clinically resembles methemoglobinemia, blue baby syndrome, but he has had zero exposure to nitrates. He is exclusively breastfed. The water in your home is filtered to a molecular level. Logically, it does not make any sense." "Do something," Catherine wailed, finally collapsing into a chair. Meanwhile, outside in the main corridor, the entire hospital floor was in a state of paramilitary lockdown. The entire catering staff from the gala had been immediately detained. Since the baby's collapse occurred at the lavish event, Security Chief Mike Miller, no relation to Sarah, suspected a deliberate, high-profile poisoning attempt. Uniformed police officers were currently questioning everyone who had been within 50 feet of the VIP section. Sarah sat shivering miserably on a cold plastic bench in the hallway, still wearing her stained catering uniform. She had been detained specifically because she was the girl observed staring intensely at the bassinet just moments before the incident. A police officer, Officer Reynolds, stood over her, his posture conveying immediate skepticism. "So you were hovering right around the crib. Did you touch the baby? Did you slip anything into his water? A contaminated pacifier?" "No," Sarah said, her voice small and shaking uncontrollably. "I was pouring water for the guests. I saw him twitch. He looked like he was seizing, but it wasn't his whole body, just his eyes and his hands." "Aha," Reynolds said, making a non-committal note on his pad, clearly uninterested in the medical opinions of a suspected service worker. "Stay put. Don't move." Sarah watched the terrifying drama unfold through the reinforced glass partition of the Trauma 1 suite. She could clearly see the array of flashing monitors, the jagged lines of Julian's vitals. Heart rate 190. O2 saturation 65%, and plummeting fast. Inside the room, the situation had passed from critical to utterly catastrophic. "He's going into cardiac arrest," Dr. Houseman bellowed. "Get the paddles charged to 10 joules. "No," Alexander screamed, lunging forward, but Dr. Sterling forcefully restrained him. "Clear." Thump. The tiny body jolted violently on the bed. The monitor warbled, the rhythm still volatile. VIB. Charged to 15. Sarah stood up instantly, pressing her hands hard against the cold glass. She watched the elite doctors frantically intubating, injecting epinephrine, and checking complicated flowcharts. They were gazing intently at the glowing screens. They were analyzing the endless stream of data. But they were fundamentally failing to look at him. Sarah's eyes narrowed, focusing on one large monitor displaying ancillary diagnostics on the wall. She had spotted a number that the doctors were actively ignoring because it seemed utterly irrelevant in the face of acute cardiac failure. His core temperature. It wasn't spiking like a severe fever. It was steadily dropping. And then, under the harsh, cold fluorescent lights, she saw it. A faint, distinct rash, a frightening spiderweb-like pattern of purple creeping visibly up the baby's neck. The purple web. A devastating memory flashed through Sarah's mind, pulled not from a clinical textbook, but from a muddy canvas tent high in the Appalachian Mountains years ago. Her grandmother, a woman the locals feared and called a witch, but who was, in fact, a master herbalist, was holding a child who had played near the wrong patch of woods. When the spider webs on the skin, Sarah, the blood turns to syrup. The heart pushes and pushes, but the sludge won't move. Sarah instantly knew the terrifying truth of what was happening. She knew that these 18 celebrated specialists were furiously treating a heart attack when they should have been treating a catastrophic total vascular blockade. She glanced around. Officer Reynolds was currently distracted by a tense conversation over his radio. Sarah did not think. She did not calculate the overwhelming risk to herself. She only knew that if those paddles shocked that fragile baby one more time, his heart would physically explode from the effort. She bolted. "Hey, stop!" Officer Reynolds shouted, but he was too slow, startled by the suddenness of her break. Sarah burst through the heavy double doors of Trauma 1. The room instantly became a solid wall of agonizing noise. Alarms screaming, doctors shouting orders, the relentless, menacing hum of the defibrillator. "Stop!" Sarah screamed, her raw voice cracking hoarsely. "Don't shock him again. You will kill him." The room froze in an instant. For one profound second, silence reigned supreme. 18 highly educated heads swiveled toward her. Alexander Vance looked up, his eyes bloodshot and wild with confusion and grief. Dr. Sterling stared at her with an expression of pure, incandescent incredulity. "Who the hell is this?" Dr. Sterling barked, pointing a furious finger. "Security! Get this lunatic woman out of here." 2 large hospital guards immediately lunged for her, seizing her arms. "It's not his heart," Sarah yelled, fiercely struggling against the men's grips. She locked eyes desperately with Alexander. "Mr. Vance, look at his neck. Look at the purple lines. It's not cardiac arrest. It's nightshade thrombosis. He's been exposed to Solanum dulcamara. Bittersweet nightshade." Dr. Benson, the visiting geneticist, scoffed dismissively, stepping forward. "Get her out. She's a waitress. She's clearly hysterical and delusional." "Wait!" Alexander shouted, and the absolute authority in his voice instantly stopped the struggling guards. He stared hard at Sarah. She looked completely deranged. Hair wild, apron stained, chin smeared with dirt. But her eyes were startlingly clear and filled with terrifying conviction. "What did you say? The rash?" "The rash," Sarah panted, forcing the words out. "On his neck. It looks like a spiderweb. It's a powerful neurotoxin from a common plant. It instantly thickens the blood into a sludge. If you shock him now, the pressure will burst his valves. You have to thin the blood. You must give him atropine. She stammered slightly, trying to recall the precise clinical term her grandmother used, but all that came was the common name. And massive heavy fluids. You have to flush it out. Dr. Sterling stepped firmly between Alexander and Sarah, his sense of professional decorum reasserting itself. Mr. Vance, please. This is a catering girl. She is obviously hysterical and seeking attention. We are medical professionals. We have run every standard toxicology screen. Classical nightshade poisoning presents with severely dilated pupils and hallucinations, not acute cardiac failure. Not bittersweet nightshade, Sarah pleaded, desperation rising in her throat. Not the berries, the sap. Did he touch a plant? A flower arrangement at the gala? Was there a vine in the centerpiece? Catherine Vance gasped sharply, her hand flying to cover her mouth. The centerpiece on the VIP table. It was exotic. Julian reached for it. He grabbed a leaf and I took it away immediately, but he had sticky stuff on his hands. He put his fingers straight into his mouth right after. A stunned, profound silence descended on the room once more. The doctors exchanged glances, their certainty beginning to visibly fracture. Bittersweet nightshade is common in Europe, not typically used in decorative arrangements. Dr. Benson scoffed again. And even if it was present, the toxicity is extremely low. It would not cause this. It would if it was the hybrid species, Sarah said rapidly, her mind now racing ahead of them. The black lace variety. It's utilized in high-end floral displays because the leaves look like dark velvet. It is highly potent to infants. Check his pupils. They won't be dilated. They will be pinpoint. That's the critical difference with the sap exposure. Dr. Raj, the neurologist, immediately grabbed a penlight and gently pried open Julian's eyelids. She stared for a long, agonizing moment. She looked up, her face utterly pale. Pinpoint, Dr. Raj whispered, the sound vibrating with shock. They are pinpoint. Coincidence. Dr. Sterling argued weakly, though he sounded significantly less sure now. Opiates also cause pinpoint pupils. It could be contamination. We do not treat based on the frantic advice of a waitress. He's dying, Sarah screamed, hot tears streaming down her face. Look at the monitor. His blood pressure is skyrocketing, but his oxygen saturation is 0. His blood is too thick to carry air. If you don't thin it, he's gone. Get her out, Sterling ordered, his massive ego finally regaining total control. Dr. Houseman, charge the paddles. We are losing the rhythm. No! Sarah lunged forward, fiercely breaking free from one guard's grip. She didn't run for the baby. She ran straight for the stainless steel medical cart. She grabbed a bag of saline and snatched a syringe of atropine that had been left haphazardly on the tray. Security! Tackle her! Sterling roared. The remaining guard slammed Sarah violently onto the hard tile floor. Her chin struck the ground with a sickening, audible crack. The vital syringe skittered away across the polished floor. Alexander watched, frozen in a terrible paralysis of indecision. On one side, the most expensive experts in the world were commanding him to trust their established process. On the other, this girl, this utter nobody, was fighting with a desperation that felt terrifyingly, fundamentally true. Clear. Dr. Houseman shouted, holding the charged paddles above Julian's tiny chest. Asterisk thump. Asterisk the small body violently arched. The monitor let out a long, high-pitched, unbroken whine. Flatline. A nurse shrieked. Asystole. He's gone. Restart CPR. Sterling yelled, panic driving his orders. Sarah, pinned hard to the floor with a guard's knee crushing her back, blood dripping steadily from her cracked chin, lifted her head. She looked directly at Alexander. They're killing him? She choked out, her voice ragged. Please check the blood viscosity. Just draw one vial. Please. Alexander looked at the devastating flatline trace. He looked at the frantic, failing, world-renowned doctors. Then he looked at the bloodied waitress. He made his choice. Stop. Alexander's command was not a request. He didn't just use his voice. He physically shoved Dr. Sterling violently away from the bedside. "Stop CPR. Mr. Vance, you are distraught. Draw the blood," Alexander commanded, his eyes burning with a terrifying, destructive intensity. "Draw the damn blood and check the thickness. If you do not do it in 5 seconds, I will personally destroy this hospital and everyone associated with it." Dr. Raj didn't wait for Sterling's permission. Driven by instinct, she snatched a syringe and inserted it into the existing 4-line in Julian's arm. She slowly pulled back on the plunger. Normally, healthy blood would rush into a syringe instantly. This blood did not flow. It oozed, thickly, darkly. It was syrupy, almost jet black. Dr. Raj gasped, holding the syringe up to the harsh light. "It's hyper-viscous." "She's right. It's sludge." The room went deathly silent again. The only sound was the singular, relentless electronic flatline tone. "He has seconds," Dr. Raj said, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "The heart cannot pump this consistency. We need to dilute immediately." Dr. Sterling stood frozen, his mouth hanging open, his entire professional worldview crumbling into dust around him. Alexander looked down at Sarah, who was still painfully pinned to the floor. "Let her up," he whispered. The guard immediately released her. Sarah scrambled quickly to her feet, instinctively wiping the blood from her lacerated lip. She did not look at Alexander. She focused solely on Dr. Raj. "Atropine to counteract the neurotoxin," Sarah said, her voice suddenly steady, rapid, and profoundly authoritative. "Rapid saline bolus. Warm saline. You have to raise his core temperature to help melt the coagulation." Dr. Raj nodded sharply, instantly obeying. But as the nurse rushed to hang the bags of saline, Sarah saw the digital clock. It had been far too long. The flat line had persisted for 30 agonizing seconds. Fluids alone would not push through fast enough. The heart had stopped. "It's not enough," Sarah realized, the terrible truth hitting her. "The veins are collapsed. The fluid won't go in." She looked at the baby. He was turning a definitive waxy gray. She had to execute the unthinkable. The flatline tone was a singular, unending note of finality, the metallic sound of death that seemed to violently vibrate the very structural walls of Trauma 1. It was the sound of a billion-dollar legacy turning irrevocably to dust. Sarah Miller did not look at the monitor. She did not look at the security guards who were hesitating, unsure whether to tackle her again or to obey the billionaire who was currently holding the chief of medicine by his expensive collar. Sarah looked only at the boy. Julian was no longer merely blue. He was a terrifying, lifeless, waxy gray. The blood in his veins had thickened instantly to the consistency of cold molasses due to the aggressive neurotoxin, causing a massive terminal hemodynamic stall. The fragile heart had ceased its efforts because it was physically trying to pump industrial sludge. "The veins are gone," Sarah declared, her voice dropping to a register of cold, absolute command. She wasn't the bruised waitress anymore. The tremor in her hands had completely vanished. "Peripheral access is entirely impossible. We need central access, but there is no time to float a line. We have to go intraosseous IO now." Dr. Raj stared at her, paralyzed by the sheer, terrifying impossibility of the demanded procedure. "The IO drill is on the crash cart." "Too slow," Sarah snapped. She lunged toward the nearby sterile tray table, her eyes rapidly scanning the complex array of instruments. She grabbed a 16-gauge bone marrow needle. It was a terrifyingly large, thick piece of polished steel, designed for piercing the dense wall of the tibia. "What are you doing?" Dr. Sterling shrieked, struggling frantically back to his feet. "She's going to stab him. Stop her." Sarah didn't hesitate. She savagely ripped the thin blanket off Julian's lower leg. She immediately felt with practiced fingers for the tibial tuberosity, the flat, strategic spot of bone just below the knee. "I need warm saline." Sarah screamed at the attending nurses. "Not room temperature. *hot*. Microwave it for 12 seconds if you have to. We need to urgently raise his core temperature to melt the coagulation. You cannot drill into a billionaire's son with a manual needle." Sterling roared, absolute hysteria in his voice. Security. Shoot her if you have to. One of the armed security guards drew his taser sidearm. The tiny, menacing red laser dot danced briefly on Sarah's back. Alexander Vance instantly stepped in front of the laser beam. He didn't utter a single word. He simply stood there, an immovable human shield positioned between the threat of the law and the deranged waitress who was about to brutally violate his son's body to save his life. He nodded grimly at Sarah. Do it. Sarah gripped the baby's leg securely with her left hand and precisely positioned the heavy needle with her right. She did not have the automated power drill used by doctors in clean, safe urban hospitals. She had to execute this the exact way they performed it in remote field hospitals in war-torn regions where batteries had died months ago. She had to use raw, focused brute force. She placed the tip against the bone and she pushed. A wet, sickening crunch. A sound of splintering calcite that seemed impossibly loud in the dead silence of the room echoed as the thick needle pierced the hard cortical shell of the tibia. The trauma was immediate and visceral. Catherine Vance let out a choked sound, her eyes rolling back, collapsing unconscious into the arms of the nearest nurse. Sarah, however, did not flinch. Her face was set in a mask of mechanical concentration. She twisted the spike, grinding it deeper past the bone's outer layer and into the soft, vital, vascular cavity of the marrow. It was a sight of raw, desperate savagery. A woman in a dirty catering uniform, covered in sweat and grease, driving a metal spike into the fragile leg of a motionless infant. I'm in, Sarah gasped, her breath ragged. Flush. Give me the flush. A nurse, eyes wide with terror but driven by trained muscle memory, thrust a syringe of sterile saline into Sarah's hand. Sarah connected the syringe hub to the IO line and pushed hard. The resistance was immense, immediate, and utterly terrifying. The marrow cavity was not free-flowing. It was packed solid with the same thick, coagulated blood that was clogging Julian's system. It's not moving. Sarah gritted her teeth, her knuckles white. Dr. Raj, I need you to compress the chest, but not normal CPR. You have to do high-frequency, low-impact. We need vibration to shake the sludge loose. Dr. Raj, whom the sheer force of Sarah's will had momentarily shocked out of her paralyzed stupor, rushed back to the bedside. She started the compressions, rapid, fluttering, almost frantic movements designed to create subtle internal shock waves, not mechanical circulation. Now Sarah yelled. She leaned her entire body weight, the full force of her slender frame, onto the plunger of the syringe. Pop. It wasn't a loud sound, but it signaled complete breakthrough. The blockage in the marrow cavity gave way catastrophically. The saline shot into the circulatory system. Get the atropine. Push it through the IO line. Sarah's command was sharp, slicing through the chaos. Dr. Raj, moving with a clarity she hadn't possessed moments before, grabbed the prescribed medication and injected it directly into the port Sarah was holding steady. Warm saline now. A second nurse, practically sprinting, arrived with an 4-bag that felt noticeably hot to the touch. They quickly hooked it up to the needle shaft protruding brutally from the baby's leg. Sarah seized the bag with both hands, squeezing and kneading the plastic, forcing the warm fluid directly into the bone marrow, bypassing every collapsed peripheral vein, deliberately flooding the central circulation with heat and a vital diluent. They waited. The monitor still screamed its flat, piercing alarm. 10 seconds. Julian lay perfectly motionless, a small, gray statue. 20 seconds. Dr. Sterling had discreetly placed his phone call, likely speaking to the police commissioner's office. Yes, murder. She's murdering him right now. 30 seconds. Sarah didn't release her grip on the small leg. Her thumb remained pressed against the femoral artery, desperately anticipating a pulse that simply wasn't there. She squeezed her eyes shut, a desperate, silent prayer forming on her lips. Please not again. Don't let the darkness win. It's over, Dr. Houseman said quietly, his voice heavy with finality. It's been 4 minutes of downtime, Alexander. His brain is dead even if... Beep. The sound was so minute, so soft after the cacophony of the flatline alarm, that everyone assumed it was a system glitch. Beep. Beep. Alexander Vance's head snapped up. The jagged green line on the monitor, moments before a lifeless flat road, spiked dramatically. A rhythm. It was disorganized, shaky, and chaotic at first, then, impossibly, it began strengthening. Beep, beep, beep. Sinus rhythm, Dr. Raj whispered. Tears instantly, involuntarily springing to her eyes. He's back. Sarah felt the pulse return under her thumb. It was thready, weak, barely palpable, but it was unquestionably there. And as the warm saline continued to flood Julian's core, thinning the toxic sludge that had halted his heart, the dreadful gray color began to recede. A faint, miraculous pink flushed into Julian's cheeks. His tiny chest rose. A ragged, wet gasp, a breath drawn deep from the lungs. And then a cry. It wasn't the weak, dying whimper from the ballroom floor. It was a loud, raw, angry, life-affirming scream of fury and existence. Pandemonium broke out. Nurses were openly weeping, collapsing against each other. Catherine Vance was being violently roused with smelling salts. Alexander Vance slid to his knees on the tiled floor, gripping the cold, metal rail of the bed, sobbing openly, his forehead resting against the mattress in utter, agonizing relief. Sarah stepped back, her knees threatening to buckle. Her hands were trembling violently now. The massive wave of adrenaline was crashing hard. She looked at the needle still protruding grotesquely from the child's leg. A brutal, ugly, absolutely necessary thing. She had saved him. You're under arrest. A voice barked directly behind her. Sarah slowly turned. The police had arrived in force, for uniformed officers standing shoulder to shoulder with handcuffs ready. Dr. Sterling, his face a mask of thwarted malice, pointed a shaking, accusing finger at her. She performed an invasive surgical procedure without a license. She assaulted hospital staff, my resident. She endangered the patient's life. Arrest her immediately. Alexander, struggling to wipe the tears and sweat from his eyes, looked up, stunned. Wait, but the officers were already moving, seizing Sarah's arms, twisting them painfully behind her back. The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked shut with chilling finality. Sarah offered no resistance. She didn't scream or plead. She simply looked at Julian one last time, watching his small chest rise and fall in a steady, victorious rhythm. She had done her job. The cost, whatever it might be, didn't matter now. Get her out of here, Sterling sneered, tasting victory. As they dragged Sarah out of the trauma room, past the stunned, silent billionaires and the weeping, newly conscious mother, she held her head high. She was a waitress being taken to jail, but she was the only doctor in that room who had truly mattered that night. The holding cell at the 4th Precinct was a stark, brutal contrast to the velvet draperies and crystal chandeliers of the Vance Intercontinental. It smelled powerfully of cheap bleach, stale cigarette smoke, and profound despair. Sarah sat on the thin metal cot, staring blankly at the chipped concrete wall. They had confiscated her dirty catering apron, her shoelaces, and, momentarily, her dignity. She had been formally charged with practicing medicine without a license, aggravated assault, and reckless endangerment of a minor. The bail was maliciously set at $50,000. She had exactly $42 in her bank account. 3 hours passed in cold, gray silence. Sarah closed her eyes, attempting to force sleep, but the image of the thick needle crunching into Julian's bone kept repeating in a terrifying mental loop. The heavy steel door clanked open, the sound echoing harshly. Miller, lawyers here, the guard grunted, uncaring. Sarah frowned, confusion masking her exhaustion. I didn't ask for a lawyer. I can't afford one. I'm not a lawyer, a deep, resonant voice said. Sarah looked up instantly. Alexander Vance stood framed in the doorway. He was still wearing his crumpled tuxedo trousers and his expensive dress shirt, though the shirt was stained with drying sweat and its sleeves were carelessly rolled up past his elbows. He looked utterly exhausted, but his blue eyes were razor-sharp, scanning the small, vile cell with a mixture of cold fury and genuine confusion. The guard slammed the door shut, locking them in the sterile silence. Alexander didn't sit. He began pacing the short length of the cell, a frantic, caged energy emanating from him. My son is stable. The toxicity levels are dropping steadily. Dr. Raj says he will make a full recovery. 0 brain damage. Sarah let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 3 long years. That's good. The heat saved him. The nightshade toxin, Solanum dulcamara, coagulates at normal human body temperature. But if you go slightly hypothermic and then introduce heat, it breaks down the thrombus. Alexander stopped pacing abruptly. He turned to face her, leaning heavily against the bars, his expression hard. Who are you? I told you. Sarah Miller. I'm a runner for Elite Catering. Don't lie to me, Alexander said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. I had my private investigators run you the second the doctors stabilized Julian. Sarah Miller, born in Ohio. No college degree, worked in diners and bars for the last 6 years. No medical training. Nothing. He pulled a neatly folded piece of paper from his pocket. But that Sarah Miller doesn't know what Solanum dulcamara is. She doesn't know how to perform a manual intraosseous infusion on a 4-month-old infant without killing him instantly. And she certainly doesn't know how to read a chaotic EKG from across a room full of noise. Alexander stepped closer, his intense blue eyes boring into hers, demanding the truth. I watched you. You moved like a surgeon in that room. You commanded that staff like a chief of staff. So I dug deeper. I ran your fingerprints, the ones the police took 20 minutes ago. Sarah looked away, her hands clenching tightly in her lap. The FBI database flagged you, Alexander said softly, the tension in the air almost painful. Your name isn't Sarah Miller. It's Dr. Serafina Miles. The name hung in the damp air like a banished ghost. You were the youngest graduate in the history of Johns Hopkins. Alexander recited from the sheet of paper the details memorized. Double board certified in pediatric trauma and toxicology. You were a prodigy. You were supposed to be the next Surgeon General of the United States. Sarah remained silent, staring intently at her scarred hands. And then 3 years ago you vanished. Alexander continued, his voice steady. You were working at a private hospital in Chicago, a Vance Global subsidiary, ironically. There was an incident, a massive fire in a tenement building. You had 2 patients come in simultaneously. One was the son of a powerful diplomat, minor burns, stable. The other was a homeless child, smoke inhalation, critical condition. Sarah closed her eyes, the phantom smell of smoke and burnt flesh still sickeningly real. The hospital administrator ordered you to treat the diplomat's son first because of the guaranteed insurance payout and the massive political connections involved. Alexander's voice was devoid of judgment now, simply stating irrefutable facts. You refused. You treated the homeless boy. You saved him. And the diplomat's son went into shock from a secondary infection 2 days later. Sarah whispered, the memory still fresh and searing. He lost 2 fingers. The family sued. The hospital, your subsidiary, threw me to the wolves. They said I was negligent. They revoked my license. They blacklisted me throughout the entire country. They made absolutely sure I could never practice medicine again. So you became a waitress, Alexander said flatly. I had to eat, Sarah said, looking up at him, a spark of defiance returning to her eyes. I had to survive. I lost everything, Mr. Vance. My career, my reputation, my home. But I didn't lose my knowledge. And tonight, when I saw your son, I didn't care about the license. I just saw the patient. Alexander stared at her for a long time. The silence stretched, heavy and profound, before he finally spoke. You saved my son's life. And my own staff, doctors I pay millions of dollars a year to, were going to let him die because they were too afraid to admit they were wrong. Dr. Sterling is a politician, not a doctor, Sarah said bitterly. He cares more about the donor plaque on the wall with your family name on it than the patient in the bed. Alexander's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. Sterling is pressing charges. He says you're a danger to society. He wants to make an example of you to protect the hospital's liability and his career. I know, Sarah said, nodding curtly. I'm ready to go to prison. At least I'll go knowing your baby is alive. Alexander reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a key. He inserted it into the heavy steel door lock and twisted it open himself. Sarah blinked, utterly confused. "What are you doing?" "I own the police station, Sarah." "Metaphorically speaking, of course," Alexander said. "The charges have been dropped. I spoke to the district attorney 10 minutes ago." "But Sterling." "Forget Sterling," Alexander said, a cold, ruthless smile touching his lips. "Sterling is about to have a very bad day. Get up, Dr. Miles. We have a press conference to attend." "I can't." Sarah shook her head, gesturing dismissively at her appearance. "I'm a disgrace. Look at me." "You are the woman who saved the heir to the Vance empire," Alexander said, extending his hand, his expression suddenly soft and serious. "You are not a disgrace. You are the only thing in this city that is real." Sarah looked at his hand. It was the hand of a man who controlled the world. She reached out and took it. The hospital atrium was packed wall to wall. Every major news network from CNN to the BBC had descended on the scene. The story had leaked. Billionaire's baby nearly dies at charity gala, and the world was desperately hungry for the drama, the tragedy, or the miracle. Dr. Marcus Sterling stood at the podium, bathed in the glaring camera lights. He had meticulously combed his hair and donned his whitest, most impressive lab coat. He looked grave, authoritative, and entirely heroic. It was a harrowing night. Sterling spoke into the microphones, projecting confidence. "A complex, extremely rare toxin, but thanks to the quick thinking of our world-class team here at St. Jude's and the cutting-edge protocols I have implemented, Julian Vance is stable." It was a flawless team effort led by myself and Dr. Houseman. A reporter raised a hand immediately. "Dr. Sterling, there are rumors of a major security breach. A catering staff member who interfered with procedures?" Sterling chuckled dismissively, shaking his head. "Ah, yes, a disturbed young woman. She attempted to disrupt the vital, life-saving procedures. Security neutralized the threat immediately. We are pressing charges to ensure she receives the mental help she clearly needs." "Is that so?" The voice boomed from the back of the enormous room. Every camera swiveled simultaneously. Alexander Vance strode powerfully down the center aisle. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was still in his disheveled gala clothes. And walking composedly beside him, head held high, wearing a clean, dark blazer that Alexander had obviously borrowed from an assistant, was Sarah. Alexander walked straight up the steps to the podium. Sterling instantly looked nervous, his smile flickering. "Mr. Vance, I was just briefing the press on our success." "Your success?" Alexander asked into the microphone, his voice amplified and echoing through the vast atrium. "Well, the hospital's success," Sterling stammered, sweating beneath the lights. Alexander looked directly at the crowd of reporters and cameras. "Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Sterling is lying to you." Gasps rippled violently through the room. Camera shutters clicked so furiously they sounded like gunfire. "Dr. Sterling and his team of 18 highly paid experts stood around my son and watched him die," Alexander said, his voice shaking with suppressed, icy rage. "They treated a heart attack that wasn't happening. They ignored the symptoms. They were ready to call the time of death." He gestured to Sarah, pulling her forward slightly. "This is Sarah Miller, or as she should be known, Dr. Serafina Miles." A murmur of instant recognition went through the press corps. The name Serafina Miles was infamous in medical circles. The fallen angel. She is the one who correctly diagnosed the nightshade poisoning. Alexander continued, his voice rising in volume. "She is the one who broke into the trauma room. She is the one who drilled into my son's leg with a manual needle while Dr. Sterling was actively trying to have her arrested. She saved Julian, not the hospital." Sterling's face turned a mottled purple. "This is preposterous. She is a disgraced, unlicensed. She is a hero," Alexander roared, slamming his hand down hard on the podium, silencing the room instantly. "And as of this morning, she is also the new chief of pediatrics at St. Jude's Medical Center." Sterling froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Excuse me, you can't do that. The board." I am the board. Alexander cut him off, his voice absolute and final. I own 60% of the voting shares of this hospital network. You're fired, Marcus. Get out of my building. The silence was absolute, heavier than any flatline. Then a single camera shutter clicked. Then another. Then a roar of questions erupted. Sterling looked around, realized his entire career had just been professionally vaporized, and slunk away from the podium, disappearing into the shadows. Alexander stepped back and gently nudged Sarah toward the microphone. Sarah looked out at the blinding sea of lights. She saw the faces of the people, the reporters, the nurses clustered in the back, the patients watching from the balconies above. She took a deep, steadying breath. Medicine isn't about protocols or insurance billing codes or politics, Sarah said, her voice clear and strong, commanding the vast room. It's about life. It's about seeing the person in the bed, not the status of their bank account. I lost my license 3 years ago because I believed that a homeless boy's life was worth exactly the same as a diplomat's son. Today, I saved a billionaire's son, not because he was rich, but because he was a baby who couldn't breathe. She looked briefly at Alexander, who was watching her with a genuine, respectful smile. I'm taking this job, Sarah announced. But things are going to change immediately. The VIP section is closed forever. From now on, at St. Jude's, the only thing that determines your priority is how sick you are. If you don't like it, you can take your business to another hospital. The room erupted. It started with a slow, hesitant clapping, which quickly built into a thunderous, standing ovation that shook the atrium. 6 months had passed since the night the monitors flatlined, but the perpetual, soft rain in Seattle remained the same, a constant rhythmic drumming against the panoramic glass walls of St. Jude's Medical Center. However, inside the hospital, everything had been radically transformed. The air in the pediatric wing no longer carried the scent of sterile fear and expensive French perfume. It smelled of strong coffee, fresh antiseptic, and the chaotic, beautiful noise of life. The velvet ropes that had once physically separated the VIPs and donors from the regular patients were gone, brutally torn down by the maintenance crew on Sarah's very first official day as chief. Now the waiting room was a true democratic mix of humanity. A tech billionaire's daughter sat happily coloring next to a mechanic's son who had broken his arm playing baseball. In the new St. Jude's, the only currency that bought you a bed was absolute necessity. Dr. Serafina Miles, Sarah to her friends, walked down the corridor of the newly christened Miles Trauma Center. The heavy white coat she wore felt fundamentally different than it had years ago. Before, it had been a costume she wore to please a board of directors. Now it was armor she had forged herself through fire. She paused at the nurse's station, efficiently picking up a chart. Her hands, which had once scrubbed greasy floors and carried heavy trays of champagne to ungrateful guests, were now steady, clean, and practiced, holding the potential lives of dozens of children. Dr. Miles, a young resident, Dr. Evans, approached her nervously. Room 304. The insurance authorization is still pending, but the boy needs the scan now. Administration says we should wait. Sarah didn't even look up from the chart. Run the scan, Evans. If administration calls, tell them to call me. And if they give you any trouble, tell them Mr. Vance is coming for lunch. Dr. Evans instantly grinned. Yes, doctor. Sarah continued her rounds, her heart beating with a quiet, steady rhythm. She was deeply tired. She had been working grueling 18-hour days to completely overhaul the department's protocols and staffing, but it was a good kind of tired. It was the exhaustion of profound purpose. She wasn't fighting to simply survive anymore. She was fighting for them. She reached the end of the hall, stopping in front of room 402. This massive suite used to be perpetually reserved for visiting royalty or major political figures. Now, it was simply a recovery room for the most critical post-op cases. She pushed the door open quietly. The room was bathed in soft afternoon light. In the center, inside a standard hospital crib, sat Julian Vance. He was unrecognizable from the gray, dying infant Sarah had drilled into on the trauma room floor. At 10 months old, Julian was a vibrant, chubby whirlwind of energy. He was pulling himself up on the bars of the crib, babbling a coherent stream of joyful nonsense at the muted television screen. Catherine Vance sat in the armchair by the window. The former supermodel looked different, too. She wasn't wearing the severe, diamond-encrusted gowns of the gala circuit. She wore comfortable jeans and a soft cashmere sweater, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked younger, softer. She looked entirely like a mother. Dr. Sarah. Catherine smiled, putting down her book immediately. He's been waiting for you. I think he knows your step. Sarah walked over to the crib. Hey there, troublemaker. Julian let out a squeal of pure delight and reached out eagerly for her. Sarah sanitized her hands thoroughly and picked him up. He was heavy, solid, and wonderfully warm. She held him close for a second longer than necessary, closing her eyes. This was the victory. Not the title, not the spacious corner office, but the reassuring, solid weight of this boy in her arms. She set him down gently on the changing table to perform a quick checkup. She pressed her cold stethoscope to his chest. Asterisk lube dub. Lube dub. Asterisk strong. Perfect. Then she gently checked his leg. Just below the knee on the tibia was a small circular scar. It was white and faded now, barely the size of a dime. It was the only visible evidence of the violence that had saved his life. The scar is healing beautifully, Sarah murmured, running her thumb lightly over it. I'm glad it's there, Catherine said softly, watching the interaction. I don't want him to ever forget. It reminds us both how close we came to the edge. He's refusing his peas again, by the way, Catherine added, intentionally lightening the mood. He threw the entire bowl at the nurse this morning. Sarah laughed, tickling Julian's stomach until he dissolved into baby giggles. He's a Vance, Catherine. He probably expects caviar and a reduction sauce. You can't blame him for having high standards. I heard that, a deep voice said from the doorway. Sarah turned. Alexander Vance stood there, leaning casually against the doorframe. The billionaire CEO of Vance Global had traded his tuxedo for a dark navy suit. But he had finally lost the air of cold, untouchable arrogance that used to define him. He looked tired, too, but his eyes were clear and bright. In his hands he held a cardboard carrier with 2 coffees. Black, 2 sugars, Alexander said, walking into the room and handing 1 cup to Sarah. You remembered, Sarah said, taking the cup gratefully. The warmth seeped instantly into her fingers. I remember everything, Alexander replied, his gaze lingering on her for a moment too long to be strictly professional. He walked over to his son, gently ruffling Julian's soft hair. The baby immediately grabbed Alexander's finger, gripping it with surprising, solid strength. How's the board taking the new budget changes? Sarah asked, sipping her coffee. Alexander smirked, a flash of the old, ruthless shark briefly reappearing. They aren't happy. They told me that opening the specialized pediatric trauma unit to uninsured patients would bankrupt the hospital within 5 years. Sarah frowned, waiting. And what did you say? I told them that if they were worried about money, they could stop buying yachts, Alexander said simply, shrugging. I also told them that I'm personally covering the deficit. The Vance Foundation is now the sole guarantor of the Miles wing. Sarah shook her head, stunned by the sheer magnitude of the commitment. Alexander, that's hundreds of millions of dollars. It's paper. Alexander dismissed it with a wave of his hand, his expression turning entirely serious as he looked back at Sarah. I used to think power was all about accumulation, accumulating ships, accumulating contracts, accumulating money. But that night when I was holding Julian and he was turning blue, I realized I had accumulated nothing of value. I was the poorest man in that room. He walked over to the immense plate glass window, looking out at the cold, rainy skyline of the city he practically owned. Yet he felt utterly bankrupt. You were the only one rich enough to save him, Sarah, not with money, but because you possessed the knowledge and the courage he had long since outsourced. He turned back to her, the polished leather of his jacket rustling as he reached into an inner pocket. He pulled out a thick envelope, weighted with serious intent. Which brings me to the real reason I stopped by, he said, his voice gravelly with emotion. Other than to see my grandson demonstrate his disdain for pureed vegetables, He handed the envelope to Sarah. It felt heavy in her hand, the expensive linen paper crisp and official. "What is this?" Sarah asked, her fingers brushing the embossed seal. "Open it." Sarah broke the wax seal with care. Inside, folded around a weighty legal trust, was a document titled The Serafina Miles Medical Initiative. She scanned the first page, her eyes widening as the dollar figures swam into view. "It's not just a scholarship," Alexander explained, watching her reaction with anticipation. "It's a full-ride grant program designed to specifically target and fund medical students who have been systematically rejected by the rigid, broken system. Students from desperately low-income backgrounds, students carrying criminal records for minor, victimless offenses committed years ago, students who had to drop out to carry the financial burden of their families, people like the brilliant young woman who was forced to become a cafeteria waitress just to survive." Sarah felt a tight lump form instantly in her throat, a wave of profound relief washing away years of stored humiliation. "We're looking for grit, Dr. Miles," Alexander said passionately, stepping forward. "We don't want the student with the flawless 4.0 GPA and the perfect SAT score who has lived a life insulated from failure. I want the student who knows the sharp, physical pain of being hungry. I want the student who will ignore protocols and find a way to save a life, the one who will drill into a bone with a manual needle because they refuse to accept death as an option. I want more of you." Sarah looked down at the document, the expensive paper blurring through a sudden cascade of tears. For 3 long, agonizing years, she had carried the shame of her past failure like a heavy, unseen stone chained around her neck. She had hidden in the hospital's shadows, scrubbing tables and mopping floors, perpetually terrified of being recognized, of having her life stripped away again. Now, not only was her name legally cleared, but it was going to be the sturdy, unshakable ladder that countless others used to climb out of the darkness and into their rightful futures. "You didn't just save his life, Sarah?" Alexander said softly, stepping closer to her, his immense frame radiating a newfound humility. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, a gesture of profound, paternal respect. "You saved my soul. You taught me that the rules don't matter, that they are meaningless if the ultimate result is unjust. You woke me up to the real needs of the world." Catherine stood up from Julian's crib and joined them, placing her hand securely on Sarah's arm, claiming her. "We owe you everything, Sarah. And just so you know," Catherine added with a warm, resolute smile, "we are family now, whether you like it or not." Sarah looked from the stunning, life-changing document to the happy, gurgling baby in the crib, and then to the imposing billionaire who was looking at her with an astonishing mixture of awe and deep, abiding respect. She wiped her eyes roughly and straightened the collar of her white coat, the fabric settling around her shoulders like a mantle of authority. She wasn't the victim anymore. She wasn't the outcast. She was Dr. Serafina Miles, and she had vital work to do. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice still thick with emotion. Then she took a deep, centering breath, the smell of rain and strong black coffee filling her lungs. "But if we're going to launch this initiative," she continued, her professional demeanor snapping instantly into place, "we need to make absolutely sure the curriculum includes comprehensive toxicology. Nobody should graduate from our program without knowing how to identify and treat bittersweet nightshade poisoning." Alexander laughed, a genuine, unrestrained, hearty sound that filled the sterile room with warmth. "Done. Consider it done. I'll update the bylaws this afternoon." Sarah finished her coffee in one efficient gulp and set the cup down. Her pager buzzed insistently at her hip, shattering the moment of peace. A multi-car pileup had occurred on the I-5 freeway. 3 pediatric traumas were incoming. "I have to go," Sarah said, her entire posture shifting instantly from emotional gratitude to hyper-focused professional readiness. "The ER is going to need all hands, and they will need the surgical team mobilized." "Go," Alexander said, waving her toward the door. "Go save the world, Dr. Miles." Sarah walked quickly toward the hallway entrance, but she paused one last time to look back at the sunlit room, at the happy baby, the grateful parents, and the profound, hard-won peace she had fought tooth and nail to restore. "I'm not saving the world," Sarah said with a small, confident and slightly wry smile. "I'm just doing my job." She turned and strode out into the hallway, her white coat billowing behind her like a superhero's cape, ready to face the storm that awaited her in the trauma bay. Sometimes the smartest person in the room isn't the one with the most prestigious degrees lining the wall, but the one whose heart cares the most about the life struggling in the hospital bed. Serafina Miles proved that true heroism isn't about rigidly following the rules or protecting a carefully constructed professional reputation. It's about knowing when to break protocol, when to risk everything, for the sake of a single, fragile heartbeat. Alexander Vance, the mogul who thought money bought immunity, learned the hardest lesson of his life. His billions could fund a magnificent hospital wing, but they couldn't buy common sense, and they certainly couldn't buy the kind of courage it takes to risk prison to save a child. St. Jude's Hospital became a beacon of true hope, not because of its fancy technology or its vast endowment, but because of its heart, which was now fueled by a deeper purpose. The Miles Wing stands today as a permanent testament to the idea that phenomenal talent and integrity can come from anywhere, even from a catering staff runner with a stained apron and an unjustly tarnished name. And every year on Julian Vance's birthday, a peculiar and beloved tradition takes place. The billionaire CEO and the hospital's chief of medicine share a quiet meal in the noisy hospital cafeteria. Not steak and lobster, but a simple waitress shift meal of greasy burgers and fries. A humble act to remember exactly where the real miracle truly began. If you enjoyed this dramatic story of redemption, medical mystery, and justice served, please smash that like button and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories about underdogs who change the world one heartbeat at a time. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a twist. See you in the next one.